have discovered that whenever one buys a new home, one's mailbox becomes stuffed with mailings from well-meaning mortgage lenders, all convinced that they can slash at what you are paying and save you money with whatever product they are selling. Then come the offers for HELOCs. The credit card companies come a-calling next. This last go-round, when we bought our house here in Philadelphia, somehow my phone number got involved, and I started getting phone calls about opportunities to save money. There is nothing quite like waking up in the middle of the night from a dead sleep in another time zone, seeing a phone number with your parents' area code. They live in a town with a lot of banks, and answering, expecting to hear bad news, only to hear the words, "Dr. Mullis, I'm calling with an offer that could save you a lot of money." I once told a friend years ago that if ever I was incapacitated, by all means, take up all of these opportunities for free money on my behalf and live large for a while. She replied, "Yes, but that would be wrong, wouldn't it?" It is true that Robin Hood stories are generally only appealing to the ones whom Robin Hood isn't robbing. Something about this parable reminds me of that reality. Now, most of us know that businesses are in business to make money. That's reasonable, and it's right, and it's what we should expect. It is foolish to expect for-profit companies not to seek profit. Nevertheless, I am sure that that steward was on pins and needles when called upon to give an accounting, which I suspect is what motivated what he did next. When times are tough, you do what you have to retain business, right? And if the business is going to go kaput, you do what you have to retain the connections so that your next opportunity may come along. It all makes perfect sense to me what the steward did. But let's be honest. Some of us are a little scandalized by this parable, aren't we? We might be scandalized because it seems inherently unfair. Frankly, like the rightful owner of the business was getting fleeced. Still, others may be slightly enjoying the fact that the rightful owner of the business is getting fleeced. But what really gets folks lit up about this parable, I've discovered through the years, is the fact that Jesus appears to approve of the steward's unscrupulous business practices. You read the story, you heard it. The business manager slashed at what was owed by the debtors. And yet, the master, the business owner, commended him on the practice as the story went along. I mean, that does sound a little bit like theft to you, doesn't it? Now, some scholars do attempt to get around this by suggesting that what the manager is actually slashing at are his own commissions. I'm not convinced. In the translation we read this morning, the business manager is identified as dishonest. That to me sort of belies the idea that he was only slashing at his own commissions. No, I think he's shrewd. He's canny. If anything, what he does is make a smart move. And it appears that his gamble pays off. And so frankly, as a rather pragmatic person myself, I'd love just to see this parable as a celebration of pragmatism. Wouldn't that be convenient? Now, shrewd and saint may not often appear in the same phrase, but that does not mean that the categories are mutually exclusive. Indeed, I have met many shrewd saints through the years. They are the folks who can squeeze maximum value out of whatever is entrusted to their care. I once knew a soup kitchen manager who could make delivery truck drivers blush with her language, and then turn around and serve up a bowl of hospitality on behalf of Jesus with a smile. She was a shrewd saint, if ever I met one. But most of us, I suspect, won't do that, or perhaps we can't do that. It leads me to particularly appreciate the way that one scholar characterizes the challenge inherent in this parable. He writes, "The life of a disciple is one of faithful attention to the frequent and familiar tasks of the day, however small and insignificant they may seem. The realism of these sayings of Jesus is simply that life consists of a series of seemingly small opportunities. Most of us will not this week christen a ship, write a book, end a war, appoint a cabinet, dine with the Queen, convert a nation, or be burned at the stake. More likely, the week will represent no more than the chance to give a cup of water, to write a note, to visit a nursing home, vote for a county commissioner, teach a Sunday school class, share a meal, tell a child a story, go to choir practice and feed the neighbor's cat. That sounds a great deal like my life some weeks. Perhaps it does yours as well. And Jesus does say, whoever is faithful in a little, you can expect them to be faithful in a lot. Still, though, there is the problem of all that money, isn't there? Now remember, a parable is just a story. And like an analogy, it will break down if you press it the wrong way. So the key in understanding parables is to look for the point that the parable is told to make. And I believe Jesus has 2 points in the telling of this parable. First, little things matter. Second, big things matter. There was a popular video on social media a few years ago, I suppose it was. I could only read the subtitles of this particular video, but the story really didn't need any language to be understood. A small boy in the video was caught stealing medicine, painkillers, from a pharmacy. And as he is caught, he's being held in the street by the pharmacy owner, and a kindly bystander intervenes on his behalf. He asks what should be the obvious question: why has the little boy stolen this medicine? It turns out that he has taken these pills for his mother. Is your mother sick? The bystander asks. The boy vigorously nods. So the man then pays the pharmacist, places the medicine in a bag, shouts to his daughter, who is making soup in the restaurant the man owns, and she rushes out with soup, and the man places that into the bag along with the pain medication and sends the boy on his way. The next scene is many years later. The kindly bystander is once more standing in his restaurant. He is serving up food when, out of the blue, he drops to the floor, having suffered some sort of neural trauma. As we see the unfolding medical scenes, we observe that his daughter, the one who had served up the soup for the little boy years before, is shown lingering at his bedside. She is leafing through the medical bills, and the sums are astronomical. The camera then pans to a youngish physician going through films of brain scans and x-rays and so forth and the like. And then the closing scene shows the bill again, but the sum has been slashed through and replaced with a zero, and a note has been written onto the bill. This bill was paid in full 30 years ago, with a bottle of aspirin and a bag of soup. This video, or one like it, made the rounds for quite a while. Here's why, I think. We all know that little things matter. Big things matter too. When Jesus told this parable, I have a hunch he was thinking, the little things matter because it is from all of the little things that the big things come. You see, when Jesus told this parable, I think he was thinking about the big picture. Jesus got the big picture. All expenses have been paid. God has done it all. And once we understand that God isn't sitting around holding an account ledger over us, we are free. We are freed to take that reality into our own being, to allow it to shape our lives, and in so doing, to be freed to love and to be the people whom God has called us to be. You see, Jesus gets the big picture. He understands what we're afraid of, and he understands what is necessary to make us free. But there's something else, I suspect, going on in his mind as he tells this parable as well, and it is this: grace is unfair. It just is. Some of us in our lives of faith will work very hard to be the people whom God has called and created us to be. And God will love us exactly the same as God loves all the folks who won't get up off their blessed assurances. That, friends, is frankly fairly offensive to those of us who think that actions deserve reward. It's really as offensive as slashing away at the accounts, isn't it? It's offensive, this story, from a finance standpoint. There is, after all, a very fine line between faithfulness and outright theft. And it's offensive at a theological level, because we so inherently want to believe that we have done something meritorious to give us God's grace. Because that's the way the rest of the world works, isn't it? You reap what you sow, you get what you earn. But that's not God's economy. And there's one other thing about this story that strikes me as I contemplate on it, and that is this. It is, at the end of the day, a very pragmatic story. Because if you want grace to reach as many people as possible, you don't go looking for ways to limit God's grace, as if we ever could. Now, I get that pragmatic and Jesus are not necessarily words that are often associated with each other. And to be clear, I want to be very clear about this. Jesus is not suggesting that it is okay for us to take a utilitarian approach to people or to the problems of the world. It is never enough for any church to do the bare minimum required to get by and call ourselves faithful and then rest on whatever laurels we have. That's not church. It's not faithfulness to the calling that God has placed on us. But what I do think the point Jesus is trying to make is this: grace has to have a starting point. And in the economy of God, the good isn't the victim of the perfect when it comes to God's grace. Now, what I mean by that is that the kingdom of God, of course, does have a perfect vision of God's shalom, or God's peaceable kingdom. And that is always what God's redemption is working toward. And it's always what Jesus' expectation will be in the long run. But sometimes transformation does, frankly, not sometimes, frequently, transformation does come in fits and starts, drips and drabs. Sometimes we start with what is small in order to get to what is big. Sometimes we start with what we can manage, what we can do in order to get to what we dream of. I hope that as we understand God's grace, we know all of these things, that Jesus doesn't wait for us to be perfect to save us. Indeed, Jesus has fairly pragmatic understandings of the likelihood of our own perfection. I hope that's all very clear to us. But even knowing this fundamental truth of the gospel, that grace is never something we earn, I suspect that if we're really honest, there's a little nervousness on most of our parts when it comes to the idea of giving an accounting for our lives. Now, one of the hallmarks of liberal Protestantism is that we reserve judgment for God. We don't try to put ourselves, or at least we shouldn't try to put ourselves in the place of God in making determinations about people's lives. The upshot of this, I hope, is that most folks don't come in here really worried about being judged when they walk in the door of the church, and that's awfully important. The downside of that, and there is a downside, is that we can look as though we are disinterested in the nuts and bolts of life, and that can translate into looking like we just don't care what's going wrong in someone's life. The fine line is to be present without judgment. But in this moment, it's important to remember two things. Number one, we are talking about a parable. Jesus told it to make a point. And number two, that God's judgment is not something of which we should be afraid. Actually, no, let's strike that. We probably should be afraid of God's judgment, but we don't need to be, because God's judgment is always accompanied by God's grace. And what is grace but the unearned, unmerited, unconditional love of God? Once we get that, there's no outstanding debt that God demands us to give satisfaction for. Once we get that, in the words of Johnny Cash, the old account was settled long ago, then we're free. We are free to be whom God has called us and made us to be. Because you see, in the Bible, the function of the judge is the one who makes all things right. Whatever has been wrong, the judge's call is to make it right. Sometimes that might mean taking a pair of scissors to the ledger book. When we understand God's judgment rightly, then we are freed to be whom God calls us to be. We are freed to live as God's image in the world. What does that look like? Some years ago, a friend of mine, a retired kindergarten teacher, brought me a book. She said to me, we are all the time telling children that they are special, and we're working to build up their self-esteem, and we should be. But we don't ever tell them what to have self-esteem for. But I found this wonderful book, and it illustrates it so beautifully. Now, at 9 o'clock, I read this book to the children, and I held it up so they could see the pictures. But in this room, that is not feasible. So I am putting the book down here on the table, and if you want to look at the pictures, you may do so after worship. But here's what the book says. Each time a child is born, the world changes. When you were born, there was a new person for your family to love and care for. And because of you, there is one more person who can love and care for others. Because of you, there is one more person who will grow and learn, and one more person who can teach others. Because of you, there is one more person to share with, And there is one more person who can share feelings and ideas as well as things. Because of you, there is one more person who needs help, and one more person who can help others. When you help, care, share, and listen, you are being kind. And when two people help, care, share, and listen to each other, they are friends. And when people from different countries help, care, share, and listen to one another, it is called peace. Even something as big and important as peace begins with something small and precious. It might begin because of you.